It began with the sound of metal scraping against stone. Deep in the forests of Lower Silesia, a crew of forestry workers clearing storm-felled trees struck something hard beneath the roots of an ancient oak. At first, they thought it was old farm equipment, another relic left behind by decades of forgotten wars. But as the soil crumbled away, dull gray steel began to shine through the mud, curved, riveted, unmistakably aerodynamic. A wing. One of the men knelt beside it, tracing the faded black outline of an iron cross half swallowed by rust. Silence fell over the clearing. They called the police. Within hours, the forest was crawling with investigators, historians, and soldiers from the local garrison. Word spread quickly. An aircraft had been discovered, buried under nearly 8 decades of growth. The excavation began at dawn the next day. Reporters arrived, cameras flashing, as diggers pulled away layers of clay and roots. The smell of oil still clung to the earth, trapped since the spring of 1945. What they found, one archaeologist whispered, would rewrite a forgotten chapter of the war. Bit by bit, the wreck emerged, a Messerschmitt fighter, its fuselage crushed but eerily intact. The cockpit canopy was sealed shut, the glass clouded but unbroken. Inside, through the dirt-streaked window, something pale reflected the light. A skull. The site fell silent again. Forensic teams marked the perimeter with tape, while local children stood behind the line, whispering about ghosts and buried treasure. The discovery made headlines across Europe. Lost German plane found in Polish forest after 80 years. Experts said it was one of hundreds of Luftwaffe aircraft that vanished in the war's chaotic final months. But as the excavation continued, it became clear this was no ordinary crash site. The instruments were intact, the propellers hadn't shattered, the landing gear had been deployed, as if someone had tried desperately to land. What was a German plane doing here, so far from the recorded front lines? And why had no one ever found it? By evening, the forest glowed under floodlights, its shadows stretching long and thin. Beneath the roots of the old oak, 2 men had slept for 80 years, their secret preserved by time and soil. The war, it seemed, was not done telling its stories. April 1945. The world was collapsing. Allied forces were pushing deep into Germany, the Soviet army closing in from the east. Airfields were burning, command posts abandoned. Yet, in the midst of chaos, 2 Luftwaffe pilots received an order stamped top secret. Hauptmann Karl Voss and Oberleutnant Emil Richter, friends since flight school, bonded by thousands of hours in the air, were to carry out a routine reconnaissance flight over territory now crawling with enemy divisions. Officially, they were to scout the Oder River for Allied movement. Unofficially, no one knew the real purpose. The mechanics worked through the night under the buzz of generator lights, preparing their Messerschmitt Bf-110. Fuel tanks full. Twin engines humming. A sealed metal case, marked only with a Black Eagle insignia, was loaded behind the cockpit. Neither man asked questions. Orders were orders. At dawn, the plane rolled down the frost-slick runway and lifted into a sky streaked with smoke. Below them, Germany was dying. Towns smoldered. Columns of refugees moved like ghosts along the roads. Emil adjusted the radio, but static drowned out the command tower. "We'll be home by nightfall," Karl said. His voice was calm, steady, the voice of a man used to defying odds. But the weather was turning. Clouds thickened over the mountains, swallowing the horizon in white. Icy rain lashed against the canopy. The compass began to spin, the instruments flickering, as if the plane itself sensed what was coming. The last message from Flight 228 was brief, garbled words half lost to interference. Crossing Oder, visibility 0, descending. Then silence. For days, command waited for contact. None came. When the war ended weeks later, no trace of their aircraft was ever found. Records were buried, bases dismantled, and the men declared missing in action. To their families, they were heroes who simply never came home. But the truth was out there, buried beneath oak roots and decades of silence, waiting for someone to dig it up. At 8:42 that morning, the Messerschmitt Bf-110 transmitted its final message. Crossing Oder River, visibility 0. After that, nothing. The signal broke into static, the kind that hums like white noise before dissolving into silence. On the ground, radio operators adjusted dials, hoping for a voice, a fragment, anything. But the channel stayed dead. Radar units near Breslau marked the blip fading from their screens like a dying ember. No distress signal, no flare, just disappearance. Hours later, locals from a small village near the river swore they saw something strange. A streak of light cutting through the cloud cover, followed by a muffled explosion that echoed across the valley. Some said it looked like lightning. Others said it burned too bright, too fast. A flash of fire in the sky, one farmer recalled years later. Then, nothing. When search teams were finally dispatched, the war had already turned. Soviet artillery thundered on the horizon. Roads were choked with retreating soldiers and civilians. Whole battalions vanished overnight. No one had time to look for 2 missing pilots and a plane that might have fallen anywhere between the Oder and the Carpathians. Reports were filed, then buried under newer, louder tragedies. The Messerschmitt became one more mystery in a war filled with them, a red dot on a map labeled missing, presumed lost. As the front collapsed, airfields were abandoned, hangars torched, and with them, the records of every mission that ended in silence. By the time Allied forces reached Berlin, the names Voss and Richter had been erased from operational rosters. Their commanding officer, interrogated months later, could barely remember the details. "A reconnaissance flight," he muttered. "Routine. They never came back." But some witnesses refused to let it go. Villagers near the Oder spoke of smoke rising above the forest that day, of distant engines sputtering in the mist. When investigators returned years later, they found nothing, no wreckage, no debris, not even an oil stain on the soil. The forest had reclaimed everything. Whatever had happened to those 2 men was sealed in mud and roots, hidden beneath decades of silence. Their mission vanished from the skies, swallowed whole by the fog of war. The telegrams came quietly, typed on yellow paper, and delivered by men in gray coats, missing in action. No further information at this time. For the families of Hauptmann Karl Voss and Oberleutnant Emil Richter, the words felt like a death sentence without a body. Weeks passed, then months, and still no news. The war ended, but their waiting didn't. Karl's mother kept a candle burning in the kitchen window every night, long after the blackout curtains were gone. She said it would help guide him home. Emil's father, a tailor from Dresden, wrote letter after letter to the Ministry of Defense, pleading for updates. None came. The world was too busy rebuilding to remember 2 men who had disappeared into the clouds. In a small apartment in Munich, a woman named Lotte Weiss folded a photograph into her prayer book each night before bed. She had been engaged to Karl. They were to marry that spring, before the war swallowed everything. "He promised he'd come back," she told a reporter decades later, her voice trembling with age. "He said the sky would always bring him home." But the sky had kept him instead. Years turned into decades. Cities rose from rubble. The world moved on, but the families did not. Letters once written in careful ink now faded to brown. Uniforms folded in cedar chests gathered dust. Every few years a rumor surfaced. Wreckage found near the Oder. A report of bones unearthed by hunters. But each lead ended in disappointment. For Emil's younger sister Anna, the waiting became part of life itself. She married, had children, and still kept her brother's flight badge pinned to her dresser mirror. "I could never bury him," she said, "because I never had him to bury." Time eroded memories, but not hope. Even as new wars came and went, as Europe healed and forgot, the names Voss and Richter lingered like ghosts in family stories, 2 men frozen in the sky above a river, their fate suspended somewhere between heaven and earth. The war had ended for everyone else, but for those who loved them, it never truly had. Time passed, but the forest remembered. After the war, the land near the Oder grew quiet again. Villages rebuilt, fields turned green, and the sounds of bombs and gunfire were replaced by the low hum of tractors and the rustle of wind through birch leaves. Yet some nights, when the fog rolled in from the river, people swore they heard something different, an engine droning faintly above the treetops, though the sky was empty. Old hunters spoke of metallic glints in the soil after rain, flashes of dull silver peeking through moss before vanishing again. Children told stories of the iron bird that sleeps beneath the roots, a ghost plane guarding the forest. No one believed it, not really, but no one went looking either. It was better to leave the dead where they lay. In the 1960s, a farmer plowing his field at the edge of the forest struck something solid. The blade jarred to a stop with a shuddering clang. When he cleared the dirt away, he found curved metal, smooth and cold beneath the sun. Thinking it might be an unexploded shell, he reported it to the local authorities. The Soviet soldiers who arrived barely glanced at it, before dismissing it as scrap from the old war. They filled the hole with dirt and drove away. The farmer never touched that part of the field again. For decades, the story of the hidden plane became a local legend, whispered in taverns and passed down like folklore. Some said it carried gold. Others swore it was a secret Nazi experiment buried to hide its shame. Most simply forgot. Then came the storms of 2023. When lightning split the ancient oak and tore its roots from the earth, the ground shifted just enough to reveal the truth. Beneath layers of soil and time, a wing emerged, gray metal streaked with rust, the faint outline of an iron cross visible beneath the dirt. What the villagers had called myth was suddenly terrifyingly real. Scientists, journalists, and historians descended on the quiet valley, their equipment buzzing through the mist. The forest that had kept its secret for 80 years was about to speak. The digging began at sunrise. Archaeologists, soldiers, and forensic experts gathered around the crater beneath the fallen oak, their breath clouding in the cool morning air. The soil was thick with clay, the kind that sealed everything it touched. As excavators peeled back the earth, the shape of the aircraft slowly revealed itself, a twisted fuselage, wings folded under like a sleeping creature. But it wasn't shattered the way crash sites usually are. The frame was astonishingly intact, its rivets still holding, the cockpit glass unbroken. It looked less like a wreck and more like something carefully laid to rest. The deeper they dug, the stronger the smell of old oil and burned fabric became. A Luftwaffe insignia appeared beneath a layer of moss, faded but unmistakable. When the serial number was cross-checked against German archives, the results stunned everyone. It matched a Messerschmitt Bf 110 reported missing on April 9, 1945, Flight 228. Pilots Hauptmann Karl Voss and Oberleutnant Emil Richter. 8 decades of silence had just been broken. Inside the cockpit, the air was dry and stale, preserved by the packed earth. The control panel was still intact, switches frozen in place, the throttle halfway forward. Then someone gasped. Through the canopy glass, barely visible under a film of mud, 2 figures sat side by side, skeletal remains still strapped into their seats. One hand rested on the yoke, the other on a tattered map. Their flight jackets had rotted to scraps, but the badges on their collars were clear enough to read. Forensic teams worked in reverent silence, brushing away dirt grain by grain. The bodies hadn't been disturbed by animals or looters. The plane had protected them, sealed like a tomb. Even the pilot's logbook, tucked into a side compartment, was still legible. Its last entry, a single line written in pencil, crossing Oder. Weather worsening. By sunset, the entire wreck was exposed. The setting sun cast long shadows across the forest floor, glinting off aluminum that hadn't seen light since Hitler was alive. 2 helmets lay side by side in the mud. After 80 years, the lost pilots of Flight 228 had finally been found. But what had brought them down here, in a forest far from the battle lines, was a question the Earth had yet to answer. At first glance, it looked like a miracle. The Messerschmitt hadn't plowed into the Earth nose first, or shattered against the trees. Its landing gear was half deployed, its flaps extended, a clear sign of a controlled descent. Forensic analysts crouched beside the wreck, tracing the shallow furrows in the soil where the plane had skidded to a stop. There were no signs of an explosion, no fire, no evidence of panic. It was as if the pilots had known exactly what they were doing. The propellers had bent only slightly, indicating low speed at impact. The cockpit glass was unbroken, and the instruments, altimeter, compass, fuel gauge, all remained intact beneath a fine layer of dust. The readings told their own quiet story. The tanks were nearly dry, the fuel needles hovering just above empty. The engines hadn't failed, they'd run out of life. Investigators stood in silence, piecing together the puzzle. Why would two experienced Luftwaffe pilots risk landing in the middle of enemy-held forest land, deep behind advancing Soviet lines? They could have ejected or tried to ditch over water. Instead, they had chosen the woods, a deliberate decision, not an accident. Some speculated that they were trying to hide, to protect whatever they carried. Others whispered about defection, espionage, or orders from the crumbling heart of Berlin. When historians examined the flight log, their confusion only deepened. The mission was recorded as a reconnaissance patrol, yet the coordinates of their route made no sense. They had been hundreds of kilometers off course, flying toward nowhere. As night fell, the excavation lights flickered across the wings, casting ghostly reflections over the twisted metal. The air was heavy with the scent of oil and wet soil. One of the archaeologists, a woman named Dr. Eva Lehmann, ran her fingers over the cockpit's control stick and froze. There, faintly etched into the metal, were initials: KV and ER, Karl Voss and Emil Richter. A personal mark carved during long hours of waiting, perhaps. It made the scene heartbreakingly human. The discovery raised more questions than it answered. The plane had not crashed. It had landed. And the men inside, bound by duty, secrecy, or something darker, had died sitting upright, hands still on the controls. Whatever brought them down here had not been chance. It had been purpose. And that purpose, long buried beneath mud and moss, was about to be revealed. The breakthrough came on the third day of excavation. As workers cleared debris from the rear fuselage, a metallic clank echoed through the forest. Wedged between twisted struts and collapsed panels was a rectangular crate, its surface blackened but still bearing a faded Reich eagle. The symbol was unmistakable. The box was heavy, so heavy it took two men to lift it from the wreckage. Its steel clasps were rusted shut, sealed by time. When the lead investigator pried them open, a hiss of stale air escaped, carrying the scent of dust and metal untouched since the war. Inside lay a mystery frozen in history. The first item was a leather binder embossed with Luftwaffe markings. Within it, coded documents written in an unfamiliar cipher. Beneath the binder, wrapped in oilcloth, were 3 small reels of microfilm, their labels burned away. But it was the final object that made everyone step back. At the bottom of the case sat a cylindrical lead container, its lid bolted tight. Radiation technicians were called immediately. The container's weight and design suggested it was meant to shield something volatile, either chemical or radioactive. The markings along its rim had been scraped off deliberately, as if someone had wanted to erase its identity. The discovery changed everything. This had not been a simple reconnaissance flight. It had been a transport mission, one cloaked in secrecy. Historians speculated the pilots might have been carrying classified research from collapsing laboratories in Berlin, or prototypes of technology meant to reach neutral territory before the Allies did. Operation Paperclip, the Americans' race to capture German scientists, had shown how desperate both sides were in those final months. But this was something different, hidden, erased. Dr. Lehman examined the documents under magnification. The handwriting was precise, the language bureaucratic. But one phrase stood out, repeated again and again: Project Nachtvogel, the Nightbird Project. No record of it existed in any archive. The forest around them felt colder as she spoke the words aloud. Whatever the pilots had been ordered to deliver had died with them in the cockpit, buried under an oak tree and 8 decades of silence. And now, after all that time, their secret had risen back to the surface, waiting to be understood. The name came to light buried deep within a cache of recently declassified wartime documents, Operation Nachtvogel, or Nightbird. Historians studying Luftwaffe communications found it mentioned only in whispers, tucked between coded telegrams and destroyed manifests. It appeared to have been one of the Reich's final desperate undertakings, a covert mission to smuggle experimental technology, classified research, and intelligence reports out of Germany before the inevitable surrender. The plan was simple in theory and suicidal in execution. Small aircraft would fly under radar, transporting key materials to remote landing strips in southern Bavaria. From there, trusted officers would move the cargo to neutral territories, hoping to barter scientific secrets for asylum when the war collapsed. Flight 228, Voss and Richter's Messerschmitt, fit the pattern perfectly. The serial numbers matched those assigned to Nachtvogel operations. The sealed metal case in the wreck contained not reconnaissance charts, but coded schematics. The microfilm reels were labeled in abbreviations used by the Reich Research Council, names once associated with jet propulsion and early missile systems. Whatever the pilots carried was never meant for open skies. It was meant to vanish, to reappear in friendlier hands long after the Reich had fallen. Documents revealed that Voss and Richter's route originated from a makeshift airstrip outside Küstrin, one of the last functioning Luftwaffe outposts east of Berlin. Their orders: transport classified materials to a hidden base near Berchtesgaden, codenamed Adlerhorst Sankt. Historians traced references suggesting the research involved high-altitude propulsion experiments, technologies that could have changed post-war aviation. But the mission never reached its destination. In the final weeks of the war, chaos ruled. Entire divisions were disintegrating, command structures collapsing under constant bombardment. Nachtvogel's couriers were scattered across the sky, their names erased from official logs to protect the operation. Most of them were presumed dead, their planes either destroyed or lost behind Soviet lines. Now, standing before the unearthed Messerschmitt, researchers realized they were staring at the physical ghost of that operation, its only surviving trace. They were carrying history itself, Dr. Lehman murmured, as she examined the wreckage, and it died with them. The forest had become their vault, preserving what the world was never meant to see. Operation Nachtvogel, once a rumor whispered by intelligence officers, was suddenly real. And its final flight had ended not in Bavaria, but in a forgotten patch of woodland, hundreds of kilometers from its intended path. Using fragments from the recovered flight log, modern analysts reconstructed the pilot's final journey. It began on April 9, 1945, at dawn, under a low ceiling of fog. Voss and Richter lifted off from the Küstrin airfield, heading southwest. Their course, plotted on digital maps, traced a line through territory already teeming with chaos, Soviet artillery closing from the east, Allied bombers swarming from the west. Satellite overlays of historical weather patterns confirmed what the pilots had faced. Violent crosswinds sweeping down from the Oder Valley, thick snow squalls, and electrical storms severe enough to cripple navigation instruments. Halfway through their route, radio transmissions ceased entirely. Allied intelligence reports from that day mention radar echoes of a lone German aircraft moving erratically across the border region, its altitude fluctuating wildly. Anti-aircraft batteries near Breslau fired several rounds into the clouds but never confirmed a hit. Investigators believe that the barrage, combined with the storm, forced the pilots to drop altitude and veer off course. Their intended destination lay far to the south, but every adjustment they made only pushed them deeper into enemy territory. Flight data analysis revealed another clue. The Messerschmitt's fuel consumption didn't match standard reconnaissance operations. They had been flying longer than planned, burning through reserves as they fought the wind. When their tanks ran dry, they would have had only minutes to find a place to land. Satellite topography of the region matched the exact contours of the forest where the wreck was found, a natural basin, flat enough to attempt an emergency descent. It all made sense now. The decision to land wasn't reckless, it was survival. Voss and Richter had realized too late that they would never reach Bavaria. Trapped between Soviet forces and exhaustion, they guided the plane down into the trees, hoping to hide their cargo until rescue could come. But rescue never did. The war ended weeks later, and their secret mission became another whisper buried beneath history's rubble. When the analysts compared the final coordinates, the revelation was chilling. The last heading recorded in the logbook, faint but legible, pointed due west, straight toward the very forest where 80 years later the world would finally find them. Their path had never strayed by accident. It had been written by the storm, sealed by silence, and left waiting beneath the roots of an ancient oak. In the days following the discovery, forensic experts examined every inch of the wreck. The clues they uncovered told a story that no wartime report ever could. The Messerschmitt's landing gear had been partially deployed, the flaps extended, a maneuver impossible in a high-speed crash. The propeller blades were bent evenly, not shattered, proving the engines were turning at low speed upon impact. It was not a fall from the sky. It was an attempt to land. Mud and roots had preserved the evidence of that final descent, the shallow grooves where the wheels first kissed the ground before collapsing under the weight of the aircraft. Inside the cockpit, the scene was eerily deliberate. The switches were set to emergency power, and one of the fuel lines had been manually shut off, a pilot's last act to prevent fire on landing. Scattered near the flight engineer's seat were a pair of rusted pliers, a flashlight, and an open tool pouch, as though someone had been trying to repair or disconnect something even after the landing. On the floor lay a small canteen, half filled with rainwater, that had seeped in over the years. There was no sign of struggle, no bullet holes or shell fragments. Whatever happened, it had been quiet. Forensic pathologists noted that the skeletal remains of one man were still secured to the pilot's seat, his hands gripping the controls. The second, however, told a different story. His harness had been partially undone, his bones shifted toward the rear of the fuselage. Near his side lay a rusted survival knife, its blade snapped, and a small flare pistol wedged between the seats. One expert theorized he might have lived for hours, maybe days, trapped in the forest, tending to his injured comrade before succumbing to his wounds. No rescue would have come. In April 1945, this part of Poland was a no-man's land, swallowed by retreating armies and advancing front lines. Any signal, any flare, would have gone unseen in the chaos. The forest itself seemed to close in around them, thick canopies muffling sound, rain washing away traces of their struggle. They were only 20 kilometers from a small village, but in that storm, in that war, 20 kilometers might as well have been the moon. The men of Flight 228 had landed with skill, bravery, and purpose. But even the best pilots cannot land against time itself. The forest had taken them, and for 80 years it kept their secret well. Among the personal effects recovered from the wreck, one artifact silenced even the most hardened investigators. In the breast pocket of Hauptmann Karl Voss's decayed flight jacket, a small packet of envelopes had been carefully folded and wrapped in oilcloth. When archivists at the German Historical Institute unsealed them, they found 5 unopened letters, each addressed to Karl Voss, Luftwaffe, 3rd Reconnaissance Wing. The postmarks were from early 1945. The handwriting, elegant, deliberate, belonged to his fiancée, Lotte Weiss. Every letter bore the same stamp across the back in faded red ink. Return to sender. Addressee missing. Doctor. Lehman read the letters aloud during the archival review, her voice trembling in the sterile light of the preservation lab. My dearest Carl, one began, I heard on the radio that the fighting has moved closer. Please, promise me you'll be careful. I dreamt of you again last night, flying above the clouds, looking down at me. When this is over, we'll walk by the lake, yes? The next line had smudged from moisture, but enough remained to break hearts 8 decades later. No matter where the sky takes you, come back to me. Each letter carried the weight of waiting, the fragile hope that love could outlast a war devouring everything in its path. The final one, dated March 29th, was shorter, written in haste. They say the Americans are near Munich. Maybe this will all end soon. When you return, I'll be at the station in my yellow dress. You'll know me by the flowers. But the dress was never worn. The station never saw him. For Lotte, time moved on without closure. She never remarried, neighbors said. She kept his photograph on her nightstand until she died in 1991, believing the Army had mistaken him for dead. He was a flyer, she once told a friend. They always find their way home. Now her letters had finally reached him, delivered not by post, but by history itself. As the historian folded the last page and placed it beside his recovered insignia, the room fell silent. In that moment, across 80 years of distance, love and loss met again, words written to the living, finally read among the dead. Weeks after the wreck was unearthed, a secure government lab in Berlin began analyzing the artifacts found inside the sealed case. The coded documents and microfilm reels were fragile, so brittle that technicians had to work under vacuum-sealed glass, each turn of the reel revealing fragments of history long hidden from the world. The first decrypted images were mechanical drawings, blueprints sketched in perfect technical detail. When magnified, the symbols and measurements became unmistakable, schematics for early jet propulsion systems. The designs were years ahead of their time: compressed turbine assemblies, exhaust compression chambers, and adjustable thrust nozzles, nearly identical to what Allied scientists would later patent after the war. The documents were marked Project Nachtvogel Phase 4, and initial analysis suggested they were based on prototype data from facilities near Peenemünde, where the Germans had tested early V-2 rockets. Experts realized that Flight 228's mission had not been reconnaissance at all. It had been a smuggling operation. The pilots had been entrusted with something priceless: the blueprints for the next generation of aviation technology. Their orders were to deliver the microfilm to a secret airstrip in Bavaria, where high-ranking officials planned to barter the data for protection in neutral territory. Had they succeeded, the history of post-war flight might have been written differently, but fate intervened. When the Allies captured Peenemünde in May 1945, many of the same scientists behind the Nachtvogel research surrendered to American forces. Their discoveries later became the foundation of Cold War aerospace programs, the jet age, the space race, even the first satellites. The forest, however, had kept the missing chapter, the one where 2 men carried the future of flight across the sky and vanished into silence. Historians now believe their cargo represented one of the last desperate gambles of a dying regime, a hope to preserve its intellect, if not its power. In that context, the story of Voss and Richter changes entirely. They were not just pilots. They were couriers of a nation's final secret. And when their plane went down, Operation Nachtvogel died with them. The world moved on, unaware that buried beneath an oak tree in Poland lay the blueprints that could have reshaped history. Their deaths marked not just the end of a mission, but the final heartbeat of a collapsing empire trying to outfly its own extinction. 80 years after their disappearance, Hauptmann Karl Voss and Oberleutnant Emil Richter finally returned home. On a quiet autumn morning, a military convoy carried 2 flag-draped caskets through the gates of the German War Graves Memorial near Kassel. The air was cold, the trees bare, their branches whispering in the wind like the murmurs of time itself. Soldiers stood at attention as a small crowd gathered, descendants, historians, and villagers who had followed the story since the plane's discovery. Some had traveled from across Europe. Others, family members, met one another for the first time, bound by names once only spoken in photographs and family legends. Dr. Eva Lehman, the historian who led the excavation, delivered a brief address. "For them," she said softly, her voice carrying through the silence. "The war finally ended today." The words lingered like the echo of an old song. Behind her, a military band began to play a slow, mournful march. As the coffins were lowered into the ground, sunlight broke through the clouds, catching the brass insignias polished clean for the first time since 1945. Among the attendees stood a young man clutching a faded photo, the grandson of Emil's sister, Anna. He'd grown up hearing bedtime stories about Uncle Emil, the pilot who never came back. Beside him was an elderly woman holding a small, silver locket. Inside was a picture of Karl and Lotte Weiss, smiling beneath a canopy of cherry blossoms. She wasn't related to them by blood, but she'd come to represent the love that outlasted the war, the one that had waited, patient and undying, through the decades. A single flyover marked the end of the ceremony. 2 jets streaked across the sky, their engines roaring before fading into the distance, a fitting tribute to the men who once carried the earliest dreams of such machines. As the crowd dispersed, Dr. Lehman lingered by the graves, placing a folded copy of one of Lotte's letters on Karl's casket. "You found your way home," she whispered. "The world may have forgotten their mission, but the forest had not. It had held their secret, protected their legacy, and finally released them when it was ready." After 8 decades of silence, the story of Flight 228 had come full circle, from the sky to the earth, from mystery to memory. And in that moment, history itself seemed to exhale, as if the ghosts of the past had finally found peace. Autumn returned to the forest where it had all begun. The leaves had started to fall again, blanketing the ground in shades of gold and rust. The excavation site was quiet now. No floodlights, no reporters, no echo of machinery breaking through the stillness. The hole where the Messerschmitt once lay had been carefully filled, the soil leveled, young saplings planted to take root where twisted metal had slept for 80 years. Only a small bronze plaque remained at the edge of the clearing, its inscription simple. Here, in 1945, 2 Luftwaffe pilots came to rest. Discovered 2023, the air smelled of pine and rain. The forest had changed little since the morning they vanished. The same mist curled between the trees. The same birds called from unseen branches. Time, it seemed, had moved everywhere but here. Nature had erased the scars of war, softening its edges, swallowing the wreck, and the memories that once screamed across this land. Yet, in doing so, it had also preserved them, held them still, in the amber of silence, waiting for the day someone would listen. Walking through the clearing now, one could almost feel it, the faint hum of engines long gone, the pulse of history buried in the earth. The forest had become a vault of stories, keeping what men had forgotten. It didn't care for nations or flags or sides. It remembered only the sound, the weight, the moment when 2 lives intersected with eternity. Dr. Eva Lehman returned once more before the first snow. She knelt beside the plaque, brushing a few fallen leaves away. The forest was utterly still, the kind of stillness that carries its own heartbeat. In her hand, she held a piece of aluminum, a small, smooth fragment of the Messerschmitt's wing she had kept since the dig. She set it gently in the soil, covering it with a handful of dirt. "You can rest now," she whispered. "Your story's been told." Above her, wind moved through the trees, low and steady, like a sigh. The forest seemed to breathe again, reclaiming what was once disturbed. And as the last light faded through the branches, it was easy to believe that somewhere within that quiet, The two men who had vanished so long ago were finally at peace. In the silence of the trees, two pilots waited, not lost, merely waiting to be found. This story was intense, but this story on the right-hand side is even more insane.